Hi, I'm Jenna Ryan. I am an inclusion, equity, and diversity strategist and the founder of Double Talk Consulting. And I'm here to talk to you today about leading inclusion diversity as an accidental expert. This is one of my favorite sessions to present because there's so much involved in developing an organization and a culture of inclusiveness that comes down to the individual experience. There's so much goes on around developing policy and programs and materials, but it's really the day-to-day interactions of individuals that really make that inclusiveness part of the everyday experience. And so this session will show you different ways, whether you're an individual contributor with little to no budget, or if you have an entire team of experts ready to go and are well funded. This will break down a lot of the things that can cause I&D initiatives to sputter, to fail, to not be implemented as well as they could have been. And so my hope is that you will take away lots and lots of resources, and if nothing else, questions to think about the next time you're designing an initiative. So let's get started. So I'm going to make this bigger, and I'm going to make me a little bit smaller. There we go. Awesome. Okay, so hopefully you're in the right session, and hopefully you've had time to take a break and do some stretching and, oh, sorry, one too many. Take a break, get some stretching, and hopefully you're enjoying your conference and all of the information and resources that are available through this. As I said, this is leading inclusion and diversity as an accidental expert. So let's get started. First, I'm going to give you a pop quiz. What is an accidental diversity expert? Well, if you're in this session, it's probably you. More and more organizations are leveraging individuals within teams and within HR, within DEI, to really implement and drive and champion these changes. And it typically falls into one or two categories. It's people who are really, really good at getting things done. They are excellent at managing projects, getting things across the finish line, collaborating across teams, and they're on that short list of people who you go to because you know that they can execute and execute well. There's also individuals who maybe have never managed a project in their entire life, but they are very passionate about making the workplace better, about making it more inclusive. We've all been in those experiences at work or in other organizations in the community where we see that something could be so much better, and we have that pull to make it better, to be that change agent that really asks the question and disrupts this whole business as usual. So if you're here, you're probably the accidental expert. And I do want to take a second to call out, I use the term accidental expert from a very loving place. My background is primarily in tech industries. I spent 20 years leading different global initiatives, launching new products, new experiences, things like that. And what I found is there's often not somebody who's an expert in a particular space. And so people will very quickly learn that they need to fill a gap. They will learn the technology, they will learn the skills, and all of a sudden they are the accidental expert in that space. It happens a lot, especially related to policy and HR, where now all of a sudden you are the one person, even though you may not know everything about it, you know more about it than everybody else on the team. And so you're really leveraged as that person who has that specific set of knowledge. So it's coming from a very happy place. I actually find that most people working in DEI fell into it accidentally. They started out on one track and realized that this is really where they wanted to focus their energy on an organizational level or on just a humaning level. So welcome. Why inclusiveness? I want to start this off with more of an introspective. So when I ask you why inclusiveness, it's really a two-part question. It's why the focus on inclusiveness for you personally now, and why is your organization or your team or your business focused on inclusiveness? And it's really not a right answer, but it really helps to understand what the motivating factors are for yourself and for your team and leadership that you'll be working with to really get to that why. And we'll touch on more on this later, but just sit with it and think about what's important. Is it, making sure that you're a better business partner in the community? Is it making sure that your employees are seen, valued, and healthy? Is it because studies again and again show that inclusive and cohesive teams have better outcomes on every measurable aspect? Just kind of sit with that. And as we go through the content here, really reflect on what's pulling you forward and what might be holding you back. So let's get this one out of the way first, because I know that there's a lot of IED, DEI, EID. In which order should those go? We tend to use the words almost interchangeably, inclusion, equity, and diversity, but each of those means something very, very different. And oftentimes what you'll see is, as I said, I'm an inclusion and diversity strategist. That is my typical focus. And then the equity component of that comes from the larger experience. So I want to leave you with this. Ideas belong. So when we're talking about inclusion, equity, and diversity, we also need to be really precise about what those words mean. So obviously inclusive and inclusion. Your organization should be inclusive. The team should be inclusive. When you're doing research for a potential consumer base, that research needs to be inclusive. You can't just look at one specific segment unless that is very specific to who your target market is. So make sure that you're very reflective. And when we talk about diverse, it is the observable diversity, but it's also different experiences and different perspectives and different worldviews all coming together. And not necessarily that they're always going to agree or get along, but they are able to bring those different perspectives and challenge each other's assumptions in a safe and trusted environment that leads to those optimal outcomes. And so it's really looking at it through the lens of our differences enhance. Our differences strengthen us, because we're going to be able to identify potential gaps in our thoughts, assumptions, things like that, long before we ever get to implementation or product launch. So the difference is really enhanced, and it's not always going to be comfortable, but that's where you get the growth, and that's where you get the more optimal outcomes. And then equity. Equity, as I mentioned, it is absolutely critical, and we need to look at it through the lens of all the different inequities that exist, that we may have walked through the world our entire lives without ever thinking about it in that lens. And so it's pay equity, gender equity, equal representation. It's making sure that not everybody comes from the same, it's making sure that we understand that not everybody is coming from the same starting point. And oftentimes, traditionally ignored, marginalized communities are coming from a place of a deficit because the way that the system is designed. Institutionalized racism, things like that, put people at a disadvantage. And so it's making sure that we appreciate and understand that and build that into everything that we do as an organization and as humans. The last three that I think sometimes can get missed in conversations around inclusion and diversity, and this is where I want to leverage external experts in the world, because you're going to be the ones at the forefront, uniquely positioned to be able to raise these questions. We have to make sure that what we're launching, if it's a product or a policy or a program, we have to make sure that it's accessible. And not just accessible in the way that we typically think about it, like having closed captions, having people with mobility issues, we're not putting up accidental obstacles, but accessible in a way that is easy for people to consume, and it's easy for people to understand, and it's easy for them to internalize. And so that is actually a much more broad word and term than is typically considered when we're rolling out initiatives. And this is one that can really make it difficult. So if we're looking specifically in the workplace and employees, accessibility could look like you have a population of employees at a corporate headquarters, and then you have populations scattered out other places in the country or other places in the world. And so how do you make sure that they also have that same level and ease of use of access to resources, information, questions, reporting, anything that they need, and feel like they're represented as well, even though they aren't just in that corporate headquarters space. So SAFE, this is another consideration that should go into every conversation around implementing a new inclusion, equity, and diversity initiative, because we have to make sure that whatever we're launching is done safely. We're not launching something for the sake of launching something and creating unintended consequences that could potentially put people in physical, emotional danger or harm, or be triggering of a previous trauma. And so we want to make sure that we've got this, to the extent that we can, we've got defined, and we understand the risks, and we can mitigate those. Lots of different ways to mitigate those. We'll talk about that later in the presentation, but just I want you to be thinking about this. And then at the end of the day, when we're talking about inclusion and diversity, it's really that sense of belonging. And this taps into a very human need. We want, as human beings, we want to be seen, and we want to be valued for who we are as unique individuals. And we want to belong to something bigger than ourselves. And I know this sounds like a huge grandiose generalization, and to an extent it is. But as human beings, we want to belong. And it's not enough just to be invited to the party. You've also got to be truly welcomed there and honored and respected and seen as who you are in the world. So what does that look like? Let's get started with the basics. Projects are projects, but I&D is different. I, as I said, spent 20 years leading projects, designing projects, multiple different aspects of it. And there are repeatable, reusable mechanics to all of it. You have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have dependencies, you have deliverables, and you have things that will go wrong, and you have to have mitigation strategies for that. But inclusion and diversity initiatives are very, very different than a typical project. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but primarily it's because humans are involved. And it's just going to get messy. Human beings are not easy to get lined up in a linear process of this and then this and then this. It can get very squishy. Also, inclusion and diversity can spark some very emotionally charged conversations and really tap into belief systems that people might not even realize that they have. So we talk a lot about unconscious bias, implicit bias, all the other cognitive biases that are causing our brain to filter through information very quickly. And it can take a lot of time to really sit with a reaction to a change or a reaction to a policy or a reaction to something else and really get people to peel back why they're having that response and what does it look like. Because oftentimes people aren't even going to want to talk about why they feel the way that they do. Myriad reasons, but it's different and it needs to be handled as such. Also, inclusion, equity, and diversity programs are essential for productive, healthy, happy human beings that work for your company, that buy from your company, who are your patients and your clients and your consumers. This is the optimal reason why inclusion, equity, and diversity initiatives are different. They also are typically viewed as something that is strictly an HR role. It falls in HR, it traditionally has. And I invite you to go back to your work in your company, your organization, and start thinking about inclusion, equity, and diversity as research and development. It's something that's not ever done. We're never going to tick a series of boxes and say, okay, we have a seal of approval, we are inclusive. It's an evolution, and we're not always going to get it right. So this is a lot of text, and I know it's a lot of text, and I'm actually going to move myself out of here so that you can take a screen grab. In my experience of 20 years of working in tech, launching different things, leading different projects, I have learned a lot. I have made some spectacular mistakes and had some really cool successes with teams, and I've learned from other people as well. I've been able to watch, people, mentors who were light years ahead of where I was, and see how they struggled and see what was coming up for them when they were at an impasse with an initiative. That, coupled with the inclusion, equity, and diversity work that I do with companies, I've uncovered 8 different top themes behind why inclusion, equity, and diversity projects struggle. And I, again, encourage you to take a screen grab of this and sit with it, because a lot of times, usually one or more of these is influencing, and they can manifest in very, very different ways. So one of the most important ones that I do want to talk about is an initiative being defined without the context of the lived experience. And the lived experience isn't just one silo of an individual segment of the population. We also have to think about it in terms of intersectionality. We're never just one thing. And too often, the best intended policies and the best intended programs come out and they want to solve a problem, but they may not have even asked the population being served if that population thinks that it's a problem, or if that solution that is being designed is even going to meet the needs of the population that it's being served. And so really getting deep into, if you think about an overarching DEI space, think about it as you've got overarching DEI, organizational health, behavior, workplace health, but then you have these very specific deep silos of people who have experience in the, who have a deeper understanding of the lived experience in things like individuals with PTSD, or veterans, or women veterans with PTSD, or the LGBTQ plus community, on and on and on. And all of those can be the same person. So it's understanding, if I roll this out, what is the lived experience and how is this going to land? And how is this going to support the people that I'm trying to support? The other one that is really, really important that we need to talk through here is a lack of proper empathetic motivation, understanding, and commitment from leadership. That can contribute to things like all of a sudden losing budget. It can contribute to what lands as lip service approach to I&D. And I guarantee you that if you launch something and it's not an internalized message from the person in leadership who's delivering it, it lands that way. It's really easy to see and to recognize that as lip service. And so I encourage all of you to take a grab of these top themes, and the next time you go back to your office, actually sit with it and look through some of the projects that you worked on that didn't have the expected results that you thought they would, or just never materialized, just kind of sat there hanging on the vine for a while, and see if you can tease out any of these underlying influences. So the first one I want to talk about, and I get this a lot, I will meet with companies, I will meet with somebody, I'll be having a coffee virtually or from a distance, and their response is, when I tell them what I do, that we've got it all figured out. We either live in a progressive area and we've got inclusion and diversity all figured out, or we have this amazing executive who's come in and has really revolutionized the entire way that we do marketing or recruiting or human interactions. And we've got it all figured out. And I'm here to tell you exactly, you do not. And if somebody tells you they have it figured out, they either don't understand the complexity of the situation, or they're probably trying to sell you something. I'm just being honest. This is way too complicated and we're just never going to know. So what comes up for me when I hear that somebody's got it figured out is kind of like this type of representation. Our process is fine. And we're not live, so I would ask you to raise your hands if you've ever heard somebody say, when you know that something isn't functioning very well and you take it to the person who can influence that change, and the response is, our processes are fine, what are you talking about? We're successful, we're making money, we have, we're a very respected company and people want to come work for us, so our process must be fine. And the reality is that for the most part, they might be too close to really understand the chaos that is surrounding them, or at least the chaos that is impacting specific populations within their organization. And it's not really big enough to get on their radar and become noticeable. So these are also some of the follow-up favorites that I get. Our process is fine. This little box over here, this little box right here, that is we don't have time to fix it. It's too expensive to fix, even if we could. Or you know what, we're going to start doing that next quarter after the reorg when things settle down. And at the end of the day, there has to be time to fix, just like there has to be time for research and development, just like there has to be time out for us to interact as human beings. Just that department, they're always complaining about something. Leadership is too old school and we'll never go for that. And I am going to talk through a few of the data points around motivating factors for leadership and how one at different levels and stages might perceive the problem differently. And at the end of the day, if we've learned nothing else over the last 2 years, we can change things. This isn't, your organization isn't something that just fell from the sky. It isn't a function of nature. It's a collection of humans and it can be changed by humans. So I have a lot of positivity around that. And then this is when it creeps up, the two at the bottom. That's what we have HR or DEI team for. And we did an employee survey on it before, and it wasn't reported as a problem. And these two I actually go deeper in, but I do want to ground us. And again, taking the conversation around inclusiveness and diversity out of just an HR conversation and really making it almost like how companies say safety is everybody's responsibility. Safety is everybody's job. Inclusiveness is also everybody's job. So I'm going to move me here so you can see this. This is one thing, my background in research and human behavior has taught me people will rationalize clinging to ideas and systems that are objectively broken. If these systems and ideas fill a void or meet a need, provide them a false sense of having control, protect them from overwhelm or emotional stress, and this is big, especially when we're talking about change in general or change that involves conversations around inclusiveness, diversity, representation, visibility, equity. It comes up, it can be very overwhelming, and we need to push through that. And then if it also prevents them from confronting unprocessed experiences or trauma. And so this is not just for people who might be resistant to change in the typical way that you would think about people resistant to change, but this is about people who might be benefiting from the potential change, but still have things going on for them and from the earlier experiences of what they been taught, what they've been exposed to, what they've experienced, and can make them resistant to change. And so it's under the best circumstances, people don't like change. They like change right up until it impacts them or makes them reevaluate how they view the world. And so again, I'm not expecting anybody watching this to see this and realize, oh, I'm going to go take this back to my organization and notes be fixed. No, this is just a base understanding that I really want people to have when you go back to your organizations, when you go back to your work, when you go back to your home and your personal life. Understand that this might be some of the barriers that you're seeing that manifest in a couple of different ways. So this is the curve of change. And this is true for big change, small change. If you're on a social media app and they change your profile and your settings and everything's in a different place from where it used to be, or you have to change your password because security said they're doing it a different way. We all go through this. It's not a linear process, and the scale obviously is very, very different if you are moving, suddenly reorg, experience a major job loss or something like that, versus I have to change how my social media looks. It's like you're going to get through this more rapidly. But the difficulty, and the one thing that I really want you to take away from this is experienced when there's a policy change that impacts somebody's insurance. It follows the same thing when when the facility announces that they are having 100% gender neutral bathrooms, or at least access to bathrooms. We go through this shock, denial, angst, uncertainty, what if. Our brains are extremely creative and good at coming up with all these different scenarios and all the different ways that it could impact the rest of the world. And we try to problem solve for all of those at the same time. And the difficulty is that some individuals get stuck right in between the what ifs. They start to go up to the explorative viewpoints and they cycle right back and they get stuck in between angst and uncertainty and what if. And you, as leading inclusion and diversity, this is where you really have a good opportunity to peel back some of that angst and uncertainty, either through your communications or through the data research that you do, focus groups, things like that. And really understand what's causing that angst and uncertainty and see if there's a path to get that person through the what ifs to exploring the viewpoints. And this is when it becomes normalization. And usually when you're around processing the integration, that's where you even can't remember what the old social media landing page even looked like your brain's just completely replaced it. And integration also helps you internalize the change, all your feelings about it, and gets rid of the next change. So we're talking about motivating factors and the challenge with having people in leadership either not having an empathetic perspective or not really understanding why this change is important to the human beings in their organization. So this survey is getting a little bit dated, but I like it. because it highlights some really interesting points. So take it with a grain of salt. It is from 2016. The site is at the bottom. It is also a relatively small sample size. It's 1,000-ish US adults who are interviewed through an online survey. So take it with a grain of salt, but it really is telling about one of the reasons why, or some of the reasons and perceptions around why people think their employers emphasize diversity and inclusion. And you'll see here that this is the term that they actually use in the survey. So that's why it's D&I versus any of the other ones we've used so far. So the survey was asking, why does your employer, or why do you think your employer is emphasizing diversity and inclusion? So I know millennials has kind of a loaded term, so we'll just say people who at the time were between 18 and 34. Their top 3 responses to that question were to make it a better place to work in general, to increase opportunities, and to improve for employee morale. And this is interesting to me because that's actually what the outcome of successfully implemented inclusion, equity, and diversity programs do. And program in the sense of it's not just something just releases and you're done, but having that consistent improvement. So then we look at the employee Gen Xers. And you see a shift here. So to increase opportunities for all, 27%. But then the second question was a tie between because of outside pressure and to make it a better place to work in general. And then we see also 21% responded to make themselves look better and improve their reputation, themselves being the company or their employer. And so we do see kind of that cynicism, kind of that sense of they're doing it because of something other than this is the right thing to do for humans. And this is also going to get us better innovation and just make it a better a place to be all the time. So then we looked at employee boomers and we see again a shift. It's still to make the better place to work in general. But then we also see 26% to make themselves look better, improve their reputation, and because of outside pressure. And so again, very small sample size, but this is really interesting insights if you're having conversations with different levels of leadership in your organization or people at different stages of their career, and you get different types of resistance or different types of perceptions that might be influenced by their generational cohort in addition to what they've experienced in their worldview. So the same study, that was fantastic. So this is a report of discrimination or bias seen, heard most frequently in their workplace. And so this is a form of discrimination or bias. So any of the following: employed millennials responded that they heard any of the following most frequently in their employment. And if you notice something here, the asterisk indicates that it's statistically significant than other generations. So we have 69 employed millennials responding any of the following, but only 57 Gen Xers and only 46 employed boomers. And that difference is really evident across the board in all of them. So when we look at age, for example, 22 employed millennials responded that they had seen or heard ageism most frequently. But again, that continues to decrease for employed boomers. This last question is phrased a little bit differently. It's a response is uncomfortable discussion of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And the percent agreed is 64% and 57 and 54, which also feels like it's reflective of what we saw in the other responses, that if Gen Xers and boomers in this population feel that their employer is only doing it because they want to make themselves look better or because of outside pressure, probably not going to be as comfortable. The other thing that can be going on with this is simply the generational cohort. It could be that Gen Xers feel slightly more comfortable talking about inclusion and diversity than their slightly older counterparts, but not as much as their slightly younger counterparts, keeping in mind that this is probably one of the first generations that came up with case rate alliances in their, not just their high schools, but their middle schools, potentially their elementary schools as well. So the reason that I do want to share this, even though, as I said, it's from 2016, is because if you look at this from the context of a typical company hierarchy, you will tend to see employee boomers more at a senior level, maybe been with the company longer, maybe been in the industry longer, and tend more towards that upper level of leadership, management, the company. And employed millennials may tend to be, at this time, closer to more entry-level, mid-level positions. Again, generalization, but we do tend to see that breakout pretty consistently. That lends itself to having the employed boomers potentially having a very different exposure in the day-to-day, exposure to different people than you would somebody who is more at an entry-level position. So people in an entry-level position might be exposed to a little bit more broader audience, but also more diverse individuals than just the other leadership people that they work with. And then this is more current. This is from 2020, and this is from GLAAD's survey. And I highlight this because there's also specifically when we're doing inclusion, equity, and diversity work for the LGBTQ plus community, there's still so much of this lack of acceptance in the workplace, in the world, and in the community. And so when we go through this, and interestingly or horrifyingly, depending on how you look at it, this was the first year that GLAAD actually saw a shift backwards in acceptance. So higher rates of non-acceptance. So this particular question that I pulled out is the percentage of non-LGBTQ plus Americans who responded very or somewhat uncomfortable in the situation. And so if you look down here, 39% responded that they were very or somewhat uncomfortable learning that their child has a lesson in LGBTQ history, or learning that a family member is LGBTQ, having a child placed in class with an LGBTQ teacher. These are really striking. And it comes to that point where we're talking about having deeply held, deeply ingrained belief systems and how those early messages really influence people's perceptions and their sense of how comfortable they would feel. And so this is a lot of also when we're talking about emotionally charged conversations in the workplace and overcoming obstacles and people who are resistant to change. This is something really to keep in mind, that we're still contending with this level. So step one is don't panic. I know this is a lot of information. It's a lot of very heavy information, and it's a lot of very deep, different aspects of information. So I don't want you to panic, because you don't have to be the expert on everything, and you don't have to solve for anything. Or sorry, you don't have to solve for everything. You do have to solve something. But don't panic and don't become overwhelmed, because that is really easy to do. So take a step back and get an action plan. Start to really deeply understand what you can control, even though we know control is an illusion. Know what you can control, what you can't control, and know what you have budget to influence and what you don't. And make those changes where you can. Start to outline where you can make these changes now and have that leading to larger, more systemic changes. I am a huge fan of one, continuous improvement and having a continuous cycle that evaluates and measures and improves on what has been learned. And I'm also a huge fan of small incremental changes. Small does not necessarily mean unimpactful or not meaningful. It's small incremental changes, because as humans, that's how we internalize change. That's how we understand change. And there's change fatigue and at every level for people, because individuals are feeling that this isn't moving fast enough. Like, people are dying, people are in harm, people are being injured, and their lack of opportunities and the lack of access is unacceptable. And so there's a huge amount of change fatigue. Is why are we just now having still these conversations? There's also a lot of change fatigue about why does everything seem to be changing and I don't even understand who I am anymore and how I fit into all of this. And those are the type of conversations that really will lead you to getting a population of people behind you and motivated. So step 1.5, look behind the refrigerator. One of my all-time favorite examples is if you had somebody come in and completely remodel your kitchen and they didn't look behind the refrigerator, all that stuff that's gathering that nobody looks at is still there. And I know this is not a refrigerator, it's technically a freezer, but I did not want to put, don't Google look behind the refrigerator, don't look at the images, because nobody needs that. So work with me on this, it is a freezer, yes. But this section itself is about cleaning out all those hard to reach places, all those places that nobody looks that it's just like either it's too mundane, it's not thought about, it's not high like a marketing or a recruiting campaign or a tagline on the side of a building. That's really big and that's really interesting and that's really meaningful. But if you look at the life cycle of the employee or the client that you're trying to support, you have to look end to end. You have to look everywhere because that's where that person is looking. And so I want you to start thinking about this behind the refrigerator look as your message, your social media posts, your employee handbook, your training, especially anti-harassment training, things like that, and make sure that what you're messaging out there is consistent with your values as a person and an organization, and make sure that it isn't something that stereotypes or it has biased language or just doesn't land well with people with different experiences. And so some examples of that, media second pop quiz. So what is this? Everybody's pretty familiar with this icon. And again, we're recorded, so I can't see your hands, but yes, I'm sure that you have sussed out that this is a save button. And it's commonly used to represent the action of saving a document, a link, whatever. This is a floppy disk. And I typically, when I do these in person, I ask people to raise their hands and put it down if they've used a floppy disk ever in the last 10 years, in the last 5 years, and then so, right? Because people know typically what this is, but it's so completely antiquated for the action that it's meant to represent. And so I want you to start thinking about all the images, all the messages, all the context of what you're putting out into the world for your company. And see, are you using antiquated systems just because we all know what it is supposed to mean in a context that really doesn't apply anymore? And so one of my favorite examples of that is when you see this symbol, see it as this, because it's the same thing. We've taken these symbols, we collectively recognize them to mean male or female, men or women, even though we know the gender is not a binary and that there are a multitude of ways of being. And why would we compartmentalize and label and force people into a box that doesn't apply, that we've learned and evolved and our understanding has changed and will continue to change? So when you go through your content, when you go through a colleague's presentation or something like that, when you're going through your own design of inclusion and diversity initiatives, take a step back and just see what is your message? What are you conveying? And is there a more precise way to convey that with what we know now and what we have available to us? So these are the big places that bias, stereotypes, and gender like to hide. They like to hide in legal agreements, policy documents, articles, manuscripts, all the places that somebody will have to review once every couple of years. They do a cursory review to make sure that it's technically accurate, and then they check the box and they move on with life. Oftentimes, press releases, social media posts, training materials, and guides are steeped in stereotypes. Gender bias, it's very subtle and it's very nuanced, but for individuals within that segment of the population that you're trying to represent and have visibility and have them see themselves in your product, in your company, working for your organization, supporting your organization, they have to be able to see themselves. And so oftentimes I will be going through a survey form or a legal agreement, and I will see default languages, he or she, his or her. And that tells individuals everything they need to know, that nobody's taken the time to look at this, or that sign that you have on the side of your building is really just a marketing campaign, because you have opportunities to get it right at every single step in the life cycle. Estimates like manpower and man hours, our language, our capacity for language is huge. And the words that we use shape our understanding, not just of ourselves, but how we interact with each other and how we interact with the world. And it sounds like a lot, and it sounds like kind of a small thing to pick on, but those words shape meaning. And if you're using words like manpower or man hours to describe, take a step back and say, what do I mean? Am I trying to say dev effort? Am I trying to say resources? What is it actually being conveyed here? And then do the work of finding that word and finding that phrasing. rather than just falling back on what we've always known. And this is actually a clip I snapped with permission from a client's agreement where they still had this sentence buried in the bottom of it. Employee guarantees to extend his support in terms of sending materials and providing feedback. So I took the opportunity to highlight this because for many years, his was the default. If the gender was unknown or unknowable, and we can do better than that. And the best thing about this, language is free. So yes, it takes time and effort to go through and change the documents and get them published and collaborate. But at the end of the day, that is a small incremental change that will really signal to the people you're supporting or the people that you want to work for you that you truly get it and that you care enough to invest the time to get it right. So step 2, data and learning. I'm a huge data geek. I hope some of you are as well. Not everybody is, it's okay. But I'm a huge data geek and a research background. So my conversation, my invitation to you is to remember that when you're looking at data and you're learning from that data, it depends on who and how you ask the question. And so many times that gets missed. We have a tendency to create surveys, questionnaires, feedback, web pages where we call information about potential customers and clients and patients. And we ask the question in the way that makes sense to us. Makes sense to us either through the organizational lens or makes sense to us based on our world experience and how we grew up and organize ourselves in the world. But if you want to be able to get a valid, tangible, understanding, meaningful piece of data, you have to know how to ask the question, and you also have to know who you're asking. I'm going to go back to that example of the employees where you have a bunch of people in the corporate headquarters, and then you have a scattering of individuals at smaller sets across the country or across the globe. If you're only asking employees for their feedback through email, you're missing out on everybody who works on a manufacturing floor in a warehouse or may not have access to email. If you're only advertising things, volunteer to share your feedback, if you're only advertising that in certain places in corporate headquarters, you're missing out on everybody else. So it's that self-selecting population that will skew the responses that you get and the actions that you take. And so make sure that you're very mindful of how you're asking the question and who you're asking the question of. So this is an example that I created earlier that takes away from the typical check a box 1 to 5. Do you strongly agree, neutral, NA, disagree, blah, blah, blah. Those are the standard go-to, and those do have a place. There's absolutely a place for that type of measurement. But if you're trying to find out what the lived experiences of your employee base, or if you're trying to find out how your customers are feeling about interacting with you, ask the question in a way that could be reflected in their words. Ask the questions in a way and structure it in a way that you can have them tell you how they're feeling. And honestly, it could be all of these. It could be 3 of these. It could be none of these. That's why you have another free text box at the end. So if they don't see themselves here, you get that additional data point of how are they feeling? What is their thought? What is their response? Where are they right now? And you've got that in a point in time. It does take more time and effort and understanding to ask questions in this way, but the data that you get is so much more rich and valuable. It looks like this. So imagine this rather than 1 to 5 with people tending to pick either all 5 or all 1. Now you actually have a representation of who feels represented, who feels that their concern not much will change, who's really full on and excited about the direction it's going. That is going to give you a much better understanding of where people are. So I also want to invite you to take a look at how you're asking the question to your customers or potential customers. This is one of my all-time favorites. This is actually a new one. I'm not going to say the website that this was, but their default title was Mr. It was pre-populated. I was filling this out and it just populated Mr. Jennifer, middle initial. And I can guarantee you, I did not make it all the way back to redeem because I was not interested in somebody who still thought that that was okay. Again, it's not something that is going to raise the flag up to leadership. It's not going to raise the flag to the owner of this, how potentially off-putting that is and how many people they could be losing. in the registration pipeline or in a job submittal pipeline. For something as small as this, that I guarantee is as part of the overall large project, this is such a little tiny blip that it just got missed. But it's not going to get missed by your potential employee who doesn't see themselves here. And it's not going to get missed by your potential customer who, again, doesn't see themselves here. So please, 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 instead of this, do this. Have a drop down with pronouns. You see, there's actually a header here that says pronouns. She, her, he, him, they, them, other, prefer not to share. Always have prefer not to share because we don't want somebody to feel as if they're forced to identify or abandon. And this is a perfect example of how you identify United Airlines and Delta Airlines and myriad other airlines about 5 or 6 years ago implemented non-binary gender identifiers or indicators when you are registering. And so that's fantastic. That seemingly small, but from a system perspective, quite large change shows the individual that, oh, they see me here. And now they have to do as a company is to make sure that everybody who is involved in that customer lifecycle is also on the same page and understands why that change is important and how to respond and what this means. So step 3 is find and fix it. So I come from a design thinking background. I look at the end-to-end life cycle, the end-to-end workflow, and try and find all those places that things could possibly go wrong. All those places where there might still be a default that says Mr., or there might be a his or her, or there might be outdated pictures. Like maybe the landing page was updated and it looks amazing, and you have all this representation and the language is perfect. But then if you go down 2 or 3 pages, is that now showing something stale, outdated, that isn't really reflecting the values of your company? That's a question only you can answer, but you have to take a look at it first. So now we're going to focus on language and images as inclusion. So this, when you see this, see it as this. Here's my little subliminal messaging at the bottom. Images and language are amazingly powerful tools to signal inclusion and to signal that you, as a person, as a team, as a company, that you actually get it. You don't just get why it's important, but you get what it means to actually do the work of inclusion and diversity as a daily practice. So find it, fix it. These are a couple other examples that this is a sign-up page for a personal stylist, an online web subscription. And they immediately ask men or women and your email address. Email address, that totally makes sense. But men and women, like again, we're automatically taking everybody and putting them into 1 or 2 categories because that's how the person who designed this understands the world. Where if you look over here, we've got trans is beautiful. So we have femininity, masculinity, non-binary, beauty your way. That speaks to not a categorization of who you are, which tick box. This is who you are in the world. How are you, which experience are you looking for right now? Who are you? And how can we support that need? And it just seems like such a nuanced, subtle switch, but this absolutely lands very, very differently. So instead of this, do literally almost anything else. I don't know how many people have seen the webpage that was created, Women Laughing at Salads, but it was started because when there was a push to have not just men represented everywhere, but women as well, every woman, no matter what the context was somehow positioned as eating a salad and laughing, or looking at a salad, or holding a salad and laughing. And so people started sharing all these images that they found, and it became, a huge place for a little comic relief. But the tragedy is that that's typically how a lack of representation is addressed. There's a lack of representation, and then there's a lack of representation, and so sorry. There's lack of representation, and then it's overcompensated by we'll just throw up some pictures of whatever we think will work, and then that's the end of it. So do the work. Representation matters, and so does context. So if I was to see this on a promotion for how much diversity is in a typically male-dominated industry, and I saw that it was a woman laughing at salad or some equivalent, that would cause me to roll my eyes and walk away, because it's somebody who just said we need to fix this, and so we did. In this case, your find it, fix it is to see what it is that you're trying to reflect there on the page or on the system or wherever it is that images are appearing, especially in online training. And just make sure that you're representing what it is that the context is speaking to. Similar to words, finding the precise words that conveys what it is you want. Make sure that your images are supporting the words that are around them and are consistent with your values as a company and as a person. So this is another example. And again, if we look at this app, this is a third-party app on the left, and it's asking for a cell phone number, and then it's asking for to choose a gender. And if I take a look at the engineering process and the entire development process of this app, and it starts way over here with the market research and the consumer research and the product and what our competitors doing, and then there's a prototype and the mock-up and the design and the beta test and evaluations and going back and forth. This could be an 18-month process. This is a heavy lift. This is really, really big and time intensive and major. And typically the focus on, let's get it right. Let's make sure that it's compatible with the things that should be compatible, that it is sustainable, doesn't break, plays well with other apps. We can get it on the devices that we want it to. And this tiny screen is such a small blip within that larger project that most people probably didn't even think to look at it. But who is looking at it is your potential customers, consumers, patients, clients, who will see that they have to choose female, male, or other, and human beings are not other, ever. So that's problematic. But I did want to highlight this, which is a fantastic example. Male, female, I want to put female on before male, but maybe we're doing it alphabetically, it would go there. But then you also have non-binary subscription. This is opening up doors for your customers, your employees, to tell you who they are. And that information might surprise you. It might completely change the way that you've been looking at your research. It may influence factors in ways that you never expected to when it's introduced with the other data points. And then also have prefer not to answer or prefer not to disclose. The consideration with this and the pushback that consistently happens is whoever manages your data will push back and say, that was really complicated. I'm going to completely have to redesign how I'm doing this. And it's going to be expensive, time consuming. I have other priorities. And I'm here to tell you as an accidental expert, it is absolutely worth your time and investment to advocate why this change is so important. And really get to that point where making this change is not just important for the user experience, which is huge, but also it's inconsistent with your values. Take this over here, I guarantee it's inconsistent with the values of the company that put that together. I just didn't see it. So find it, fix it, look behind the refrigerator. This is another example, women's health. Instead of that, it depends. What is it that you're trying to convey here? If women's health, if your visual representation of women's health is this, you're leaving out a huge segment of the population. And it's based on a stereotype. So just really take a step back and say, what is the response or information that's being conveyed with this, not just the language, but with the image? Because women's health is not just, as this icon would have you believe, women's health is not just about a pregnancy. They're mutually exclusive. So just try and figure out what it is that you're trying to convey here. If this is pregnancy resources, myriad other options that you could do that would make it more clear. And make sure that as you're making these changes, that it's part of a larger holistic strategy. If it's just kind of a one-off, I'm going to focus, go really deep, and all my images are going to be amazing, something else is going to get missed. It's all got to flow together. And so take a look at it, that design thinking perspective, and make sure that you're looking end to end on how this conveys and how it relates to everything else that that consumer, that employee will experience in that channel. So last, recovering when it all goes so very wrong. This is true for every project that has ever been. Things are going to go wrong, and you have to have rollback plans, contingency plans, mitigation plans. Things are going to go wrong that you never even expected, that you never even thought about. And again, why you want to build into that continuous improvement. But the important thing to focus here is it's going to go wrong. It's not if it's going to go wrong, it's when. And the best advice I want to give right now is that you take a step back, take a breath, because as human beings, our brains are immediately going to go into defensive mode. That's not what I meant. I'm not that type of person. All of the other things that your ego will try to put out to protect yourself. And take a step back, take a breath, take a pause, and really evaluate that lived experience of the individual who has been harmed, who has been damaged, you have, however unintentionally caused offense, and understand that lived experience and why the message or the image or whatever it was conveyed would have landed very differently for an individual who didn't walk through the world like you. And just being really cognizant and aware of what that feels like. And then apologize unequivocally, unqualified apologize. Not, I'm sorry that you feel that way, but just, I am sorry. And then educate yourself to do better and then actually do better. There's a lot of different ways that you can do. You can practice reflective language. You can get used to an individual's pronouns by repeating them to yourself on the drive to work, or I guess as you walk down the hallway to your remote office. Practice language internalizes language and it rewires your brain. And that's how we get those new neurological patterns going. But at the end of the day, it's really important to make sure that you're not making it about yourself and your intention and what you meant to do and how you wish it would have gone. And make sure that you are really clear on this was a mistake, here's what we're doing to resolve it, and then do that and do better. And leverage your experts. Honestly, if you're not sure how this went wrong and you're not sure why people are reacting that way, reach out. There are so many people who are able to give you that guidance, that advice, that expertise, and coach you through that lens of this is why, this is what could have been problematic, and this is what you can do in the future to put some safety rails up. So with that, I want to thank you for your kind attention. That is everything that I have today. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference and the rest of your sessions and the rest of the day. This is my contact information. If you have any questions, I am always more than happy to connect. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I wish you well.